Welcome everyone to the From Exascale to Quantum and Beyond, the Future of Federal HPC R&D BOF session, and thank you for joining us. It is well known that federal investment in emerging R&D is critical to promoting and protecting American innovation and international leadership in science and technology. In 1991, the United States Congress passed the High Performance Computing Act, which recognized the critical need for U.S. leadership in high performance computing, providing increased federal investment in HPC and a coordinated federal program to ensure continued U.S. leadership in HPC. At the same time, the White House Office of Science and Technology published a report outlining a development strategy for HPC and a framework for a multi-agency HPC program. These events forged a collaboration that continues today and has evolved to include investments across the frontiers of information technology. The Networking and Information Technology R&D or NITRD program is the evolution of the original coordination program from the HPC Act, and with 25 member agencies and 60 other participating agencies, continues to support the federal government role in the thriving U.S. information technology innovation ecosystem that uniquely integrates expertise and resources spanning the federal government, academia, and private industry. When the HPC Act was signed, there was less than $500 million in federal HPC investments. Last year, federal agencies invested over $6 billion in IT R&D, much of which is directly or indirectly related to HPC. These investments have led to breakthroughs that we take for granted today, from weather modeling to agriculture, from auto manufacturing to entertainment, and from cell phones to advancing the understanding of human diseases like COVID-19. We can all agree that HPC is critical to the research, design, and production of tomorrow's discoveries. As NITRD looks forward to another 30 years of advancing scientific discovery and technological breakthroughs and innovation, we are also committed to democratizing access to computing and data, building an inclusive workforce, ensuring responsible application of computing, and maximizing the benefits of science and technology for everyone. SC21 is the perfect venue to take lessons from the past 30 years and look forward to these and other challenges that will expand the frontiers of human knowledge. With exascale computing imminent, quantum on the horizon, vast troves of data available, and a growing movement to enable access to computing for everyone, I am joined by three distinguished researchers in HPC and related technologies to discuss the future of federal HPC R&D. Dr. Talitha Washington is director of the Atlanta University Center's Data Science Initiative and professor of mathematics at Clark Atlanta University. As director, she oversees and provides strategic direction of data science across Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse School of Medicine, and Spelman College to increase the number of African Americans with expertise in data science. Dr. Dan Stanzione is Associate Vice President for Research at the University of Texas at Austin and Executive Director of the Texas Advanced Supercomputing Center. Dan is a nationally recognized leader in high-performance computing and the principal investigator for an NSF grant to deploy Frontera, the fastest supercomputer at any U.S. university. Jerry Sheehan is Assistant Director for Scientific Integrity and Data Access at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He leads U.S. government-wide initiatives to advance open science and protect against undue interference in the conduct, communication, and use of federal science. Jerry joined OSTP from the National Institutes of Health, where he served as Deputy Director of the National Library of Medicine since 2017. So let's get, and I'm Cami Roberts, sorry. I'm Cami Roberts, I'm Director of the National Coordination Office for the NITRD program and the moderator for today's panel. So let's get started. I have a question for you first, Jerry, if you're ready. With advances in HPC came advances in data-driven science, which in turn brought advances in healthcare, including therapeutics for COVID-19, but there's still so much to be done. With the Biden administration focus on improving healthcare for all Americans, what do the health and data science communities need from HPC to transform healthcare, and what is needed to get us there?
Well, thank you, Cami. I think it's a great question and a great way to start our panel, which I think can both explore the future of high-performance computing R&D and marking, as you indicated, the 30th anniversary of the High Performance Computing Communications Act. I think it's important to just remember that health and biomedicine have always been, and they're going to continue to be, key elements of high-performance computing and communications, both as a primary application area for high-performance computing communications, and is an area that can help drive some of the requirements and some of the needs. And I think we should note the fact that the first director of the National Coordination Office for High Performance Computing Communications, now, as you said, the NITRD office, was Donald Lindbergh, MD, who was at the time and for many years thereafter, the director of the National Library of Medicine at NIH, in fact, my home institution. And I think his appointment some 29, 30 years ago reflected an early interest in promoting the applications that could benefit from high performance computing, in addition to the underlying computing and communications technologies themselves that so many other federal agencies are pursuing. As you said, with that $6 billion investment that just from last year. I think health and biomedicine, again, have long driven high performance computing communications needs. In the very early days, it was everything from just the transmission of images and videos from CT scans and others that were too large for most available networks. Modeling of protein folding, right, a key element of molecular biology, which was often too slow. It ran too slowly on the supercomputers of the day, and for advanced research in computerized tomography, MRI, other imaging processing technologies that needed advances in computing and networking. I think when I first became involved in work at the intersection between high performance computing and biomedicine and health applications, we were continuing to strain the existing computing and networking capabilities that were being used as a model to drive requirements for then the next generation internet. Large images and protein folding models were still challenging, but so were emerging concerns about the privacy of electronic medical records that were being transmitted across the internet. And we've seen now in much more widespread use, especially driven by the pandemic. Video for remote consultations, which also blossomed during the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, for wide-scale surveillance of public health to support our public health response efforts. Again, another area we saw considerable attention in during the pandemic. I think if we fast forward now, 20 years to 2021, almost on the cusp of 2022, where we've seen these incredible advances in high performance computing, including the emergence of cloud computing, the deployment of broadband internet, and bringing healthcare to all Americans, as you asked in your question, also means extending broadband to all those Americans. And I can tell you that my colleagues at OSTP and elsewhere in the White House complex now are incredibly excited that the bipartisan infrastructure deal will provide yet another boost to more wide-scale broadband across the country, with about $65 billion in investment there. We also are taking lessons from the last 2 years of the COVID response. And I indicated a few areas through telehealth, electronic health records, and so forth that saw incredible advances during that period. We also saw advances in what we call open science by making more of the results of research, biomedical research and others, more freely and readily accessible to the public and to other researchers and others in the pandemic response community, both in terms of making available sequences of the SARS-CoV-2 genomic sequence and its many variants. That's allowed us to accelerate vaccine and therapeutic developments, track public health. We also made accessible the largest corpus of full text literature related to not only COVID-19, but all associated coronaviruses that attracted a lot of attention from the AI community. And I think what we're seeing now is advances in high performance computing are being accompanied by the emergence of data-driven science in biomedicine and elsewhere. Biomedical applications very much driven by genomics research, but still large image data sets, public health data, and increasingly now data from clinical research and clinical care that we're trying to mine to better understand effective therapies, effective treatments for disease. I think that this data-driven science is going to be further supported by federal efforts that are promoting more widespread requirements for managing and sharing of data that result from our federally funded research. And this follows on an OSTP memorandum that was issued 8 years, almost 9 years ago now, on increasing access to the results of federally funded research. And as more and more of research data become available, there's growing interest in using high performance computing, in particular around the applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning to generate new knowledge from the analysis of these larger and larger data sets. We've already seen a number of federal agencies turning to more cloud-based services for hosting large data sets. and co-locating them with computing resources and analytical tools. At the NIH, for example, they've transferred tens of petabytes of data from the Sequence Read Archive into commercial cloud platforms, along with some of the most heavily used sequence analysis tools, such as BLAST, the basic local alignment search tool. Our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, has established agreements with commercial cloud providers to improve access to atmospheric and weather data to also make it more readily available for modeling and analysis, much of which is taking place in high-performance computing. This kind of interest is driving more opportunities for collaboration between the HPCC community, the scientific research communities, data scientists, as you call out, and those who are involved in data management and curation. We need a lot more research now to find better ways of making large data sets more AI ready and to make them what we call fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We need to do this while making access more equitable, as you indicated, to all researchers at all institutions, across the country, around the world as well. While at the same time, we make the underlying data more secure and ensure that it's trustworthy, it's well curated. Within across the federal government through the National Science and Technology Council's Subcommittee on Open Science, we're beginning to explore some of the infrastructure needs to advance these notions of open science and to make data more fair. How can we make the data, computation, and analytical tools more readily accessible to allow data discovery and use across agencies and research disciplines, from astronomy and biomedicine to toxicology and other fields? We believe this work is going to benefit from closer interaction with the high-performance computing community to help identify R&D needs and to then implement solutions. And it's also going to benefit from work of colleagues of ours, Cami, at the National AI Initiative Office and the National Science Foundation. We're coordinating efforts to develop a roadmap for a national AI research resource, the NAIR. This is envisioned as a shared computing and data infrastructure that will provide AI researchers with access to compute resources and high quality data, along with appropriate educational tools and user support. The task force is in the process of producing a roadmap to address how to establish and sustain a research resource like this, addressing topics such as ownership and administration of the resources, governance mechanisms, secured access controls, data engineering issues, provision of curated data sets and educational tools, user interfaces, and of course, their implications for privacy, civil rights, civil liberties, and other topics. I think all of this work is going to require us to bring together researchers in the high performance computing community with researchers from a variety of different scientific disciplines and the data management communities to better understand emerging needs, practices, and technologies. I think it will create a future for continued application-driven R&D and high-performance computing communication. And certainly the biomedical community will be there, willing to work with the HPC community to drive this future forward and take advantage of Exascale and beyond. So thank you, Cami, and I'll look forward to the further discussion.
That's great, Jerry. That's a tall order. Lots of things going on there that we need to make sure we can carry forward. So Dan, your HPC career was actually just beginning as the HPC Act of 1991 was signed. How have the changes in hardware applications, data, and people impacted HPC, and what do you see as next on the horizon?
Yeah, thanks, Cami. Really those four things are what are HPC, right? Hardware, software, applications, people. And they've all sort of co-evolved in amazing ways. I mean, and yeah, I was, a first-year grad student when the act passed, and now it's hard to believe it's been 30 years of working on this, but I went back and did a little math and realized that the last system we deployed here was 40 million times larger than in terms of capability than the system I was deploying in 1991 when the act passed. So also versus when I was a first year grad student, I have 1,000 times larger budget, but we are scaling faster than money. But the hardware is really just the tip of the iceberg, and it drives a lot of these other changes. But it's really been how the hardware has changed, what we can address in HPC and what that's meant for our jobs, right? So I mean, so the bigger scale is the obvious thing of of the data, of the computing, and that we can tackle much larger problems. But there's also a lot of sort of scope change, right? If you were working in HPC, not even 30 years ago, but 15 or 20 years ago, right, you certainly didn't think about helping users with prepping their data sets for AI and having like curated data sets ready for training, as part of the, part of your center, which is now, something everybody has to do, right? You didn't think so much about, you thought about your data lifecycle, but you didn't worry about the user's data lifecycle. You didn't worry as much about experimental data, about reproducibility, about uncertainty quantification, right? So we've seen, as the resolution, as the amount of data we can process, the size of the models grow, we've seen the algorithms evolve so that we're doing real-time data assimilation and inverse problems and things like that. And that has meant, that we have to also evolve sort of how we operate, right? So, if you ran systems, even maybe 10 years ago, we didn't think so much about the service level agreements. We didn't think about interactive use. We didn't think about quality of service, except maybe if you were doing visualization, you worried about interactive use, but that was, a small niche of what we do. And, most of HPC was a command line thing, and except for the visualization folks out here. And now for, the majority of our users, not really the majority of our time, it's a web-based thing, right? Either as an embedded service, where you're accessing HPC via APIs or via web gateways, using Jupyter notebooks, right? So, which meant we have a much broader base of users that we have to support, a lot more dialects of the scientific language we have to speak to support those people. And just, the combination of all those capabilities means we're seeing HPC sort of leak into all these fields, sometimes not actually called HPC, but, scientific computing or AI, or under some term, sort of get into fields, traffic management, environmental sensing, a lot of fields that we didn't see as being relevant, a decade or two ago. And so, I think we're starting to see funding, as we look towards future funding. First of all, I think, a lot of the HPC funding won't necessarily be called HPC funding in the near future. There's obviously things like Exascale, and those systems will be deployed and the ECP will complete. But then if you look at some of the new initiatives coming down the pipe, you see this sort of both ubiquity and increasing scale and embedded under other names in sort of the programs that are coming down the pipe. And of course, we can't speak for any programs that aren't yet funded, but three that have just been sort of tangentially involved in the planning of that I think are worth mentioning is one that Jerry already mentioned is the AI research resource, right? Which I think will be what will end up being a fairly significant HPC investment that's not called HPC. It is coming down the pipe. And I think, the systems, the data systems, the software systems, and the pieces of hardware that get funded through that, we're going to see a lot of papers at SC in future years that have to do with, things that are coming out of the AI research resource. And I'm one of the members of that task force that Jerry mentioned that's planning it. And I can assure you, a lot of the issues that we're seeing there, map to the issues that all the HPC centers face now. So, so that's one place where it won't necessarily be called HPC, but there's, promising for a lot of funding in these new applications and how we use data, et cetera. Another one that also has been mentioned, but out of closer to your office, but, OSTP has released the blueprint for something that grew out of the COVID consortium, but for the National Strategic Computing Resource, right? Which really recognizes the importance of HPC and these sort of urgent computing problems, whether it's responding to the pandemic or wildfire modeling or, both forecasting and recovery from severe weather events, tornadoes, hurricanes, et cetera, right? Earthquakes. There's so many areas that, where if there is a disaster, somewhere there's a lot of data and somewhere there's computing involved. And it may be, in the more traditional HPC areas, like, take a hurricane, for instance, in the simulation piece to decide where it's going to make landfall. The more modern version is now, coupling that to wave height and real-time assimilation of data from ocean buoys. And then you bring that down to the street address level and you look at flooded cities and, what's going to be inundated and what roads are passable and not. And then you have the sort of immediate recovery phase where you're looking at, how fast can we bring in drone data and satellite data, airplane data, on the ground imagery, do damage assessment, again, direct first responders, sort of during the immediate aftermath. And then there's long-term recovery where you look at, what got into the water supply when chemical plants were overflown or things like that. And how do we build infrastructure to recover from that? And how do we build infrastructure to make sure the next one isn't as damaging? And so there's HPC really at all phases of that. And I think the National Strategic Computing Resource is a look at how we might fund HPC in some of those areas that haven't always been HPC in a more sort of organized way. So we prepare for it. And then the third thing coming down the pipe worth mentioning is an effort that I'm also a little bit involved with, is the planning for the Leadership Class Computing Facility, which is NSF, taking what at least, so NSF has been almost 40 years in funding HPC centers one way or another at this point, but really in the last 15 or so, it's been, systems here, systems there, some services and separate grants. And the LCCF is looking at building, sort of entrenching computation as a long-term investment at the NSF, not only linked to the other large NSF scientific investments, but also for the broader user community, right? And how NSF can sort of sustainably fund systems and people and software to make this happen. So we tend to buy the hardware more than we balance the investment with systems and people. So, and that's, again, still has to make it through the planning process and get appropriated over the next couple of years. But you see, the LCCF is an example of where we're just making sure computing is sort of a sustainable investment at an agency. The AI resource is sort of the branching out into other things, not necessarily called HPC, but sure look a lot like it. And then the urgent computing is how, the NSCR, National Strategic Computing Reserve, is how it's sort of branching into other fields. So you see this recognition of all the directions that HPC is going in these future funding efforts.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. All interesting things going on, and much like what Jerry said, so much to keep up with and maintain. So Talitha, turning to you, the AUC Data Science Initiative is an interdisciplinary program that's striving to both increase the number of underrepresented minorities with data science experience and use that experience to help solve societal challenges that impact our minority communities. This addresses part of what the National Science Board terms the missing millions. How's the program breaking through these barriers, and how do we expand programs like this to engage underserved communities in the computing side of this equation?
Yeah, thank you. So great to be here. And like you said, I'm the director of the Atlanta University Center Data Science Initiative, and I work collaboratively with Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse College, Spelman College, and Morehouse School of Medicine, which are 4 historically Black colleges and universities co-located near downtown Atlanta. Now, historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, essentially they're institutions of higher education in the United States that were established before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with the intention of primarily serving the African-American community. So when we think about data science here in the AUC, we think about the need for diversifying who is doing the data science, and also we think about the diversity of who's in the data sciences. We have Morehouse School of Medicine. They're very in tune with that in looking at health equity. They do have a really amazing health equity tracker. Got to put a plug in for their Satcher Leadership Institute. But essentially, we're in the works of defining a pathway, a roadmap for data science, so to speak. So the Atlanta University Center, we're also home to W.B. Du Bois, who was a sociologist and also a data visualizer. He did a lot of data visualizations back in the day. He was also one of the founders of the NAACP. And he used data visualizations to talk about the story of African Americans in this country, to advocate, and also to say how well we are doing in spite of maybe less help from the government and let's say societal ills at the time. And so we really kind of ground our work in using data science really for the social good and to challenge some of our institutional racism that exists in multiple facets. Because we've seen how data science can cause harm to predictive policing models that overpredict people of color, they overpredict African Americans. We've also seen challenges in the health industry when we're talking about creating these machine learning enabled devices, and perhaps these devices are made on data sets of people that don't look like me. So if I go get treatment, I'm going to be in trouble, right? So we've seen that. We've also seen how the facial recognition just frankly doesn't work. We've also seen how when people go to the airport to put their hands under the wash basin to wash their hands are not recognized because the hue of their skin does not match what those technologies were made around. So these computing, it really impacts people and society and lives. So I think about, yeah, we need the research, but we also need to make sure that when we develop these technologies with the end user in mind, we need to do this from a diversity lens and be intent on that. So here, the way that we're approaching it is really just having that intentionality and having the conversations outright that what are some of the challenges around data science? How do we really bring equity into data science? Not only in who's doing the data science, but how it's being analyzed, what are the methods, and then also how is it being messaged, and to make sure that the biases of the researcher, the biases of the data set don't get exacerbated in that process that could actually lead to more harm. So I have in an ecosystem of faculty who are really just ready to upskill in data science, and they've been doing so. We've held a number of summer workshops. We have in the School of Social Work at Clark Atlanta University, I have a team of 4 faculty who's going to lead a social work data core for students in social work so they could leverage big data to make more informed decisions in the field of social work, which is a new arena, but it speaks to the applicability of data science really across the disciplines. Now, when we talk about HPC, technologies, equipment, infrastructure, well, that has been highlighted a little bit more recently. It's been known, but it's been brought to the forefront more recently by the Ignite HBCU Excellent Act. Ignite stands for Institutional Grants for New Infrastructure, Technology, Education, and then for HBCU Excellence. So this act, it looks at building repair, addressing that, deferred maintenance, campus modernization, which includes technology and broadband. So historically in our country, there has, and it's so hard, it's a difficult topic, but historically in our country, a number of minority serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities in particular, have been underfunded due to the institutionalized race system that exists in state systems, and we've seen lawsuits and things of that nature, but also in funding from federal agencies to state to local, right? So we see these multiple ways that HBCUs have been underfunded in technology, and it impacts what and how we do things. So one of the things that we're working to pull together is a working group so we can actually bring an HPC, some sort of facility here to the Atlanta University Center, because we don't have it. We can go up the street, but the idea is we need to build our own and grow our own, because we are doing it. We have the researchers, we have the scholars, we have the expertise, but access to the technology is a challenge, and it's a real challenge. And I'm thankful for acts like this that actually bring this to people's attention, because if people don't have access to the equipment, to the technology, to the data set, how can we expand the talent? Because these problems, these advancements really necessitate everybody in it and being able to contribute to it. So if I were to think about just 3 ways about how we're thinking about data science and addressing some of these issues, is first access to data science, that's equipment, broadband, technology, classes. I mean, just expansion of access, you name it, it's in there. And the second one, when I'm thinking about data science, is content. How are we equipping our students to go forth and contribute in HPC? How are we training our graduate students to conduct research in that? How are we supporting our faculty to really bring that content not only into the classroom, but also new knowledge into the field? And the third one is really just implementing programs and implementing support structures to really move the needle. So it's not only the institutions that already have it, and then they just do it, and that's it. Because I think, what do they say? If you keep doing what you've always done and expect different results, that's kind of insane. So we need to think about funding. We need to think about access. We need to think about who has what in different ways. It's not, I shouldn't have my faculty go up the street to have access to this technology. We should have it here, right? And so, because when we think about HBCUs, we're only 3% of all institutions of higher education. However, 17% of all bachelor's degrees awarded to African Americans, they come from HBCUs. And in addition, about 27% of African Americans with bachelor's degrees in STEM disciplines come from HBCUs. So we're a significant producer of talent in STEM, and we have the leverage to go and make an impact in who's doing HPC, how it's being advanced, how we can bring more diverse researchers into the field, but access to equipment, research, all of that, building that infrastructure so that our researchers and students can thrive. It's an ongoing challenge. I mean, we're up for it. We're doing it. We're working hard with what we have, and we're working to build. And then the next part is building along with other HBCUs. So I'm currently working on building a network with other HBCUs on how we can equip them or support them in their development of both data science research and education. And that definitely will involve technology. And how do we address those institutional structures that really spur that innovation so they can be continue to contribute to the research enterprise.
Very good. So I think one of the things I'd like to point out, I think, and I'll turn it back over to you in a second, Talitha, but whenever you talk about data access, it's not just about getting access to the data. It's having data that can be used by the systems that are using it. Is that right?
That's right. It's not just the raw data itself, but yes, you need the systems in order to, let's say, do something with the data. So, yeah.
Right. And Jerry, I think you've been experiencing this through your career, having curated data that is in a form and a format that you are able to actually take advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of work that I've done has been on trying to serve up data and information in ways that are, broadly accessible. But one of the challenges that we're thinking through now, and I'd welcome input from Talitha, from others in the audience too, is how do we ensure that when we're making these data resources accessible, that they're accessible in ways that address the needs of various audiences and various users, and knowing that, especially I think as we saw in the pandemic, right? We want to make them available to other researchers in the field. There are lots of researchers outside the field who can also make use of them, or it's practitioners in different areas, right? Pandemic, it was the first line responders and others. You can think of it in other fields as well, where it might be engineers, people in the entrepreneurial community who want to make use of data, or communities that are trying to understand challenges and problems in their own local area, whether they're environmental or others. How do we make the data so that they're accessible and usable by these other communities? And some of that is standards, but they have to be accessible standards, and with proper use, we'll use metadata, because we can't have a conversation or a panel without mentioning metadata. But how do we provide the metadata and the documentation and so forth in ways that other people can find them and are accessible? And we'll kind of explain the provenance of the data and other conditions around it to help them make better use of it. And I think that's another one of those hard problems, and what Dan was saying too, as high performance computing is sort of spreading into all of these different communities. You mentioned the many different dialects that we need to now speak, and our communities are going beyond the researchers who are at the center of HPCC.
That's right. Thank you. So I think the thread that comes through all of your discussions was that exascale may be out there and quantum's coming, but here today and now we need to get these resources out as Jerry just said, beyond the researchers, out to the practitioners, out to the public, there's people out there who could take advantage of these, and finding ways to do that and to give them access to the computing resources that they need in order to, make timely discoveries and not just, slave away for hours and days and months and years because they don't have the compute resources that they need. So any suggestions on how we do that? Get the HPC resources? I mean, HPC, as Dan said, HPC is morphing into something else, and we don't know what acronym we'll be using for it in the future. Maybe it'll all be the NAIRR, AI Research Resource.
Not all. Yeah, some, not all. So, how do we go about that? And there's, a question in the chat I see that I think, it is sort of relevant to that. And and maybe I can hit the chat question and then address your point, Cami, while we're at it. So, somebody's asking, what's the big deal about data access? Anyone can go on the internet and educate themselves or waste time. The choice is theirs. But yeah, I think there is a lot of data on the internet, and you can find a lot of data in a lot of topics. Can you find it in a usable form to do the things that you want to do across the areas you want to ask questions about, right? And can you find it in sufficient quantity and quality to build a model around it, right? Particularly when we're thinking, whether it's, I would argue that most AI models right now are statistical models, but right, if you're building a statistical model of something, or even trying to validate another model, there's so many places. And I mean, we have just here at TAC, several billion files that we share out, right? I think the public files in our natural hazards engineering repository is something like 730 million files, right? Yes, you can find those on the internet. That doesn't mean you can do anything, unless you're versed in how those were built. One, you're never going to read 730 million files and figure out what you want to do with them, right? Because it turns out there's 730 million of them. So, and that's to Jerry's metadata point. It's like, okay, so you say, so some of those are from various experimental instruments, right? So I want to study, roofs in a wind tunnel, right? So we have a bunch of imagery of that, right? So, so maybe you could query roof and you could query wind tunnel in that, giant repository we have, and you might get that data, but do you have all the data you need about how that roof was built, about how things were tacked down in that roof, about what angles the cameras were at in the wind tunnel when it was taken, the resolution of the video stream, the distance of the camera from it, what was the frame rate, what was the conditions of the wind tunnel itself when it was running, right? There's just a massive amount of data that you may need that you may not have. Right. And so you can spend another few hundred hours doing that. And then if you want to get data other than from our experimental facilities, yeah, you can Google wind tunnel data, finding sets that will work, that are organized with the same fields and the same tabs. And, all of these individually are solvable problems, but in the net, something I've seen is that more than 90% of most AI machine learning type problems right now are data preparation, right? Gathering and cleaning the data. And that's if you have all the access to it, right? And if you're doing something in medical data, then who do you have to clear your access with? If you wanted to get data for, responsive treatments for all diabetes patients or all patients with a certain kinds of tumor, we may have the data, but it's only been, one, you may not have access to it because you don't have consent. Two, even if we have the data and you're a place to have access to it, it may not have been collected with permission to use it for that purpose. So we can't synthesize across clinical trials on diabetes, for instance, because we didn't tell the patients at the time that their data might be used in a way other than for that particular study, right? So, getting it on the internet is something that we've had a lot of success with, and it's step one. Getting it into a usable form where I can start a Jupyter notebook and not spend the next 4 years writing data converters to answer the first question that I wanted to answer is another problem. And there are, take a private sector example, right? I know of a large bank, right, that just spends has almost 1,000 people sitting cleaning data from just quarterly reports and 10Ks and SEC filings, which are technically all public. In fact, they are all public, right? You can go grab them. They're technically all filed in the same format, but there's corrections over time. How do you know if 3 quarters later they didn't correct the data from 3 quarters ago, right? So you have to go through all of it and clean it all and put it all together. And the effort of that is 1,000 full-time people working on just data cleaning so that they can begin the process of modeling, right? So to say, go figure it out, I think massively underestimates the effort of what it might take to solve your particular problem. And do we really want all of our researchers trying to figure out how you build a roof that can survive a hurricane, spend the next 4 years writing data converters, or do we want them to build better roofs, right? So there's, there is a lot of data out there. There's a lot of useful data out there. There's a ton of you can learn about it to be productive with it. But that doesn't mean we have all the answers to all the problems at this point.
Good points. Thank you, Dan. So Jerry, when you were speaking, you'd asked a question of Talitha and the participants in this BOF about what they're looking for and what OSTP can provide them in terms of data policies and management. Do you want to restate your question and see if we can get some answers from people?
I'm trying to remember what exactly my question was.
Speaking of reproducibility,
I know.
Exactly. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think there are several questions there, right? But I think they are around how can we, coming back to this particular question, right? How can we ensure that as we are through the federal agencies, making more data available? And some of that's government data, others is data that's collected by researchers that the government funds, right? Are there ways that we can make it available that will make it more reusable and more interoperable, right? So coming back to those FAIR principles, we can do things to make data more discoverable. I mean, that findable and accessible, right? Those are the two easy parts of FAIR data. The interoperability and the reusability comes back to what Dan was just saying. I can pull data together. I don't know how it was collected. I don't know all of the, it might be from different organizations, different institutions that collected it and used different data standards and so forth. And if we want to kind of move from this being just the domain of the experts and the other researchers, you might have the time to invest in doing that. And bring it out to an environment where practitioners and others and those in the public can make better use of the data. Yeah, how can we improve the way that we're serving up the data? How do we not only put out the banquet table, but we make it so that all can come and join in the feast?
Before my current gig, I was a program officer at the National Science Foundation. Not speaking on behalf of the foundation, but I was there. I've worked in the Convergence Accelerator. And so in that unit, we thought about research with deliverables and products to solve problems of societal interest, and with the end user in mind. Who will use this, right? Who's that end user? So if we build these data sets and put them out, like the person said, on these fancy websites, maybe with some YouTube tutorials, well, how do you know that people are going to actually pick it up and do something cool with it, so to speak? So it's like, just because you build it doesn't mean that they will come. So I know recently, I have to get back to them, so this reminds me, I talked with NIH about their biodata catalyst and so they have all this data online. It's all good, it's great, but their concern is they're not really engaging diverse researchers in what they're using with this big platform. I mean, it's nice, it's great, I mean, every data set is going to have a drawback, but so the thing is, I said, you just can't put it on a website and expect people just to come in and use it and have the time to spend. I said, why don't we just sit down and work and fund a workshop or two, or so people understand, where is this data coming from? How do I approach it? How can I use it? What are some examples? So get in the nitty gritty, because the people who already know how to use it, that's nice. But if you want to broaden access, we need to create those entry pathways not assuming that people really know how to approach or think about a nice resource such as this one. So it kind of went over the thumb tonight. Maybe I should reach back to them. But I do like the idea of a good informative workshop that really talks about how do I think about this data set that's available? How could I use it? What are some examples? And to get people to think about how can they then use it? Because if you hear about it in a context like, oh, this could be actually useful for that. So, I mean, yeah, so workshops and just not assuming that just because it's out there, people are going to come and use it. There's also people coming from technological infrastructures. Do they have the infrastructure needed? Do they have the tools required in order to interact with available data? And so that's another funding opportunity. So one funding opportunity is to bring people in an active or proactive way, but then also equipping people with the technology needed in order to do it, to expand access. Not all institutions are well-resourced, and there are good researchers at a lot of different places. And so just making sure that there are pathways for different people to come in and perform the work, not in the way that people would expect, let's say, a well-resourced or R1 institution, but just in a, I don't want to say, just kind of a grassroots sort of way, just to make sure that we provide different entry pathways into this data ecosystem. So we're not creating obstacles for people to push the research envelope forward. So those are two that come to my mind.
Very good.
That I would fund.
Dan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? You discussed a little bit during your previous answer, so. Very good. Okay, so we have time for some questions from the audience. I'm pulling up my Slido. Let's see.
Thanks,
how.
And Cami, I can't see the chat from my system. So if there's there are comments or questions coming in, yeah, I'll rely on you to
Well, absolutely, absolutely, yes. You know, you're hampered in that.
While you're pulling that up, I'll give a number 3. The number 3 is if there are certain, let's say, a group of researchers you like to bring in, have some listening sessions to kind of figure out what the obstacles, barriers are, right? So like here in Atlanta, you know, I could host a listening session here at AUC or HBCU wide, what have you, right? For HPC needs assessment, that sort of things. That's something I could do. That wouldn't be hard to do, but actually to hear and listen, what are the needs, what are the barriers, and what sort of items, technology supports, whatever, could equip researchers to really engage in this. So the third one would be like a listening sessions and leverage people who are in the field who are connected to the audiences that you're trying to connect with, whether it's the researchers, practitioners, people in the field, what have you.
I think probably, I mean, a lot of those that you're suggesting, those are great ideas, or that they're all the hard things that are the easy things, right? I mean, it seems part of it is the intentionality, right? So we need to think about broad communities of users when we are, for example, making data more accessible. We probably need to think about broader communities of users, as you were saying, on having access to the tooling, the high performance computing, the networking, and so forth, that can allow them to take advantage of and make use of it. And the tools of the listening sessions and workshops and so forth will then be ways that we can try to carry that forward. And I think maybe the key is making sure that up front, you know, we've got that intentionality built into our processes, so that we know to even do that and bring them together and don't just reach out to the usual suspects, right? And our the initial communities that know very well how to serve their own needs, and that's a primary audience too. But how do we get beyond that?
Right, and not to assume that they'll be like the usual suspects.
Yeah,
I would actually assume that they may be different, whatever that is.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience. To meet the stated objective to ensure U.S. leadership in HPC, what response is needed to the meteoric rise of HPC capability in China?
Well, I could start on that one. I've had a number of conversations with people in government about that over the last few years, actually. And, I think this may tie to the second question a bit. So one is to not have general panic over the flops numbers, right, that are coming out, right? So it's what do the machines do is where we need to focus on, and, how broadly are they using them? But nonetheless, there's been tremendous progress in China. I think we've spurred their, by cutting off their access to Intel, NVIDIA, AMD chips, we've spurred their progress in semiconductors more than we could have in any other way, to guarantee that industry evolves there, which, the competition piece of that might actually be good in the long run. But but I think it does validate, right? They're making these huge investments there in, on the semiconductor side, on the programming side. And, they've sort of really shifted in the last few years away from looking at just the hardware to looking at these broader ecosystem issues we've talked about, right? You can build the hardware now. Can you build the programming models and the tools? And can you train enough people to use it effectively to really validate that investment? But I think in many ways, it validates what we're talking about here, right? The importance of the federal government making this investment is recognized by places like China, and they're making huge investments, right? And so, and it's not entirely to get the highest number on the top 500 list, right? It's because they see the connection to this in scientific progress and in economic growth, and what they're doing is why they're making these huge investments. So to some extent, I sort of welcome it, because it makes it a lot easier to make the case that we need continued federal investment as well, and the Europeans need to keep making investments, and everywhere around the world, because it does show that it's not just us talking about it, trying to drive the government to do this. It's many other governments recognize this as well and are prioritizing these investments. So, to not put too fine a point on it, I think it's good for us in the federal R&D field to see these huge investments in China. So, but meeting them flop for flop is probably not the goal. I think we need to look at sort of the ecosystem capability and meet them there, right? And make sure our researchers can do the things that our researchers need to do. So.
Very good point, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry or Talitha, do you want to add anything?
I think what I would do was echo Dan's point. I mean, I think as we're saying, it is the ecosystem, and we need to move it all forward at the same time, right? Being the leader in one component of it isn't going to give you a lead or an advantage overall. And to the point of also stimulating federal government investments in high performance computing and related fields. I think those are areas that are highlighted in the R&D priorities memo that the administration sent out, I think in July or August of the last year, about catalyzing research and innovation in critical and emerging technologies. And it calls out artificial intelligence, quantum information science, advanced communication. So I think HPCC, broadly construed, is well represented there. And Cami, you'll be collecting the numbers on just how much that translates into spending across the federal agencies. But I think there is quite a bit of priority there. But again, recognizing it is the broader ecosystem that we need to be attentive to.
Right. There are some bills on the Hill that are being discussed, to help focus these things. Who knows where they're going? So I'm not going to mention any of them specifically, but if you're interested, you can go search the web and find something. Lots of support in Congress to expand HPC and related technology R&D through the federal government. So another question was, one of the award talks this morning was on translational computer science. It sounded like this discussion hits on that. How is this discussion related?
So I admit I missed that talk this morning. I was listening to all the file system paper talks this morning. So we got to do better on that stuff. But but I can sort of speculate as to what it means. And I have long argued that sort of what we do and what some of our users do, and that there is a distinct difference between computer science in its pure form, and I've been on a computer science faculty, and then there's the sciences that we actually impact, but then somewhere in the middle there's computational science and engineering, right? And that it's a distinct thing, right? And then now in many fields that's being called data science, but if you're still doing computational chemistry or something like that, you might think of it more as computational science. But it is the difference between, being able to put into practice, right, the advances of computer science in these sort of both scientifically and societally relevant ways, right, that we're going to use these things moving forward. And so, to use them, you don't necessarily need to know about, the theory of order of algorithms, or, you don't necessarily need to know a lot about graph theory, but there is this notion of how can we make things work at scale? How can we, apply modern hardware in effective ways to do science and to advance society, right? So, I think it is related in the sense that, as I've tried to stress, right, we need these sort of balanced investments, not buying just big machines, but we need to invest across the ecosystem in data, in people, in systems, in software, right? So, and I think the computer science is one of the inputs for that, right, that really drives it. And translational computer science, but how do we get that from, machine learning not being, and it increasingly isn't, right, just the provenance of CS experts, right, but a pillar of computational science and engineering more broadly.
That's good. Thank you, Dan.
Can I hit the next question on that list? Because I know we're running a little
Sure.
short on time. Just
Go
very
ahead.
briefly, because I think it's a great question that Igor posed there. On the balance between doing a few heroic HPC runs and many modest scale HPC workflows in hardware provision and services offered. And I think part of that is in the way we build the programs, right? And the way we design these things, right? And so we can build big systems pretty well, but then it's how you allocate them, right? So, do you want to solve, did you build the big system to solve things at the full system scale or to solve lots of things, right? It's the standard capability versus capacity sort of argument. And I will tell you, and this is far from being in the report, but in the discussions in the AI research resource, the way we're tackling that is building it into the metrics of the program, right? And so one thing that has been discussed is, can we have, and that I'm totally in favor of, is can we have a metric that says, and this relates to meeting the challenge of China and everything else, top 500, that the researcher who receives the largest allocation on this resource is capable of solving problems at the scale of any other researcher in the world, right? Whether they're in a corporate environment or in China or wherever else they happen to be, right? If you're using the AI research resource and you've justified that you deserve the largest allocation, can you solve the world's most challenging problems? And then also putting in a metric for concurrency, right? So, if the goal is to enable, every student to run a Jupyter session, at every university, it's sort of the one node, one GPU, interactive session, right? What does that mean in a metric? 10,000 concurrent sessions can be supported on the resource, for instance, right? It's the one that we've thrown out there, right? So, because not every student will be at the same hour every day, right? But so we can have metrics that say, I need to run GPT-5, right? 2 models around from GPT, right? And I need to be able to train a model at that scale. But at the same time, I also need to be able to support 10,000 concurrent sessions. And then you leave it to the providers to sort of figure that out. But I think we got to build those metrics for both the deep mission and the wide mission into the programs at the beginning.
That's great. Thanks for covering that, Dan. I appreciate that. So we are down to 1 minute. I really want to thank Dan and Jerry and Talitha for joining us today and giving us their insights into what's going on now, what's coming in the near future, and what's down the pike further. So do any of you want to have one last, anything you forgot to say? Now's your chance.
I think I got my time.
No, I think I got my points in too, and I was glad to hear Dan's last point too about it's the getting the high end, but also getting some breadth and greater capacity into our high performance computing. We're trying to get more capacity into data access issues, and then the flip side of that is, I think as Talitha was saying too, we need greater capacity in our ability to make use of more information and data for AI applications and others, which I think are becoming areas of translational computer science. So tie all of those threads
All this
together.
together. Very good.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see what the future brings for HPC. So we shall see. The best is yet to come.
Yes, exactly. So the NITRD commemoration of the 30th anniversary of HPC will continue. We have a short video that will be released in early December, discussing many of the things that have happened in those 30 years. And sometime in the spring, we'll be holding a symposium, a day-long symposium, focused on both looking back and looking forward, and talking with some of the researchers that have been funded or hope to be funded in the future, I guess. So stay tuned for those things. You can follow NITRD on Twitter or LinkedIn. And also tomorrow morning, Larry Smarr's giving an invited talk on the rise of the super network data intensive computing, which is covering the last, I believe, 35 years of HPC. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of the sessions at SC21.